Right. So I'm from the European Commission. I'm not from EY. I don't do slides. I don't have anyone. I was never trained in making such excellent slides. I don't have anyone working for me who can produce slides. So you'll just have to deal with my voice. Now, where do I start? And I think MiCA or MiCA, whatever you want to call it, really has been a bit of or is a coming of age process of crypto assets and blockchain in Europe, in the European Union, but also at large because European Union regulation gets emulated the world over. Now, I also celebrate a 10-year anniversary right now, just like Paul. 10 years ago, I was appointed in the European Commission's Financial Services Department as the advisor on technology, on financial technology, on point 3 of your talk, where finance meets technology. And the reason why the department appointed me as advisor, as sort of leading this work, was because I was always going on about technology and how wonderful it was and everything it could be doing. And so my bosses said, look, we've had enough of this. You're in charge. Sort of go away, do something, but leave us alone. So anyway, that's what I did. And fast forward, so in 2015, I started working on technology, the confluence of technologies and finance. And the first issues I really got to deal with were cybersecurity and cloud computing. But if you're dealing with technology and finance, even if you make no effort, you're going to come across blockchain. And I'll admit, a little bit ashamed, that the first time I ever heard of Bitcoin was in the course of 2017. Before 2017, I had never, ever heard of Bitcoin. I had no idea what it was. And blockchains had no idea what they were. But since then, I've become extremely interested in them. Not that I'm a great expert on blockchain or crypto assets. I do believe that my expertise lies in financial market infrastructures and everything that's wrong with them. And if you know what's wrong with financial markets and financial market infrastructures, and someone or some movement comes along, which is a blockchain movement, you'd sort of say, yes, I can see the future. And the future which Paul just painted, we've been trying to help along to the extent we can. Now, as a regulator, or as a policymaker at the European Commission, I am acutely aware of the fact, and this is a quote from Ronald Reagan, who I think we can quote now because he's now considered to be a moderate, that the most dangerous words in the English language are, I am from the government, I'm here to help. So we generally try to help this future, which Paul so very fluently and brilliantly painted, to help it along because we believe it is good for finance, but actually it's good for the entire economy. Now, so my claim to fame in this really is that I was appointed in charge of technology and be the tech geek or the tech excuse in the department, and I started looking into these issues. And so in 2017, 2018, we saw the first big Bitcoin bubble, but we also saw something like ICOs, initial coin offerings. And I thought, this is absolutely brilliant. The fact that you can raise vast amounts of capital, money, for ventures to build stuff. Because we were always saying, how can startup companies, people with a good idea, how can they get access to capital? How can they raise capital? And they didn't raise thousands of dollars. They didn't raise hundreds of thousands of dollars. They raised millions and millions of dollars. They raised so much money in their ICOs. They raised more money than they could ever expect to make, whatever it was they were going to develop. So they never developed anything, they just ran off with the money. So the ICOs kind of failed, but it was still a good idea. And so we said, if only we could put this into a framework to onshore this crypto activity in the European Union. Because we saw Europeans being interested in crypto. By no stretch of the imagination, they were as interested as, for example, people in Asia or people in the US. They were very much more into it. But Europeans were also getting into it, and they were investing their life away, gambling their life away on exotic venues in exotic places, usually with lots of water around them and lots of palm trees. And we sort of said, that's a pity. I said, we should try to bring this and onshore it in the European Union. And most of my colleagues sort of said, oh, Peter, you're wasting your time, don't do it. All of this blockchain stuff is going to end in tears. It is just one big recipe for money laundering, sanctions evasion, and what have you. So I came up with this plan of what eventually became MiCA, sort of an outline of a market structure regulation, mainly focused on crypto asset service providers and a bit on disclosure standards for issuers. But the traction I had for it was zero. There was just no way I was going to get this out of the European Commission, and there was just no way I was going to get this through our parliament and through our council representing the member states in a shape or form that I had in mind. So I continued doing a bit of my missionary work of trying to tell people how wonderful blockchain is. It's actually just an accounting system. So here was me, someone who was known and has been on record to say that the most boring people on the face of the earth are, no, usually I say it's insurance people, but the second most boring people on the face of the earth are accountants. And, sorry, no offense meant, but blockchain really is an accounting system on steroids. It really brings accounting to the next level, and everything you can do with that. So I was going around, and then in the course of 2019, we had a lucky break. And the lucky break was that a large social media company and its friends had the audacity to launch a stablecoin. And I remember they approached the European Commission and said, look, we have a wonderful technological innovation we want to come and talk to you about. So my boss sort of said, go and speak to our resident geek. He'll love to talk to you. And so they present this idea of a stable coin. Of course, people say, well, we should come with Facebook. They came and they explained what they wanted to do. And I said to them, and my colleagues were shocked, because I had my colleagues that would miss it, I think this is an absolutely brilliant idea. But you have a problem. You have two problems. The first problem is that they wanted to build a stablecoin on a basket of currencies. I said, the central banks of the countries whose currency you take in the basket are not going to like it. And the central banks of the countries whose currency is not in the basket, but where this coin is going to lose, are going to like it even less. And actually, that was one problem. Second problem is, no one is going to like Facebook doing this. But for the rest, brilliant idea. And it turned out that I was wrong. Not about the fact that Facebook, but it turned out I was wrong because it wasn't that central banks didn't like it. They hated it. They hated it with a vengeance. Nothing of this nature could happen unless a regulatory framework was in place. The finance ministers and central banks of around the world gathered in the Financial Stability Board and the G20, and they said, no global stablecoin arrangement should be launched before a regulatory framework is in place. Something needs to be done. I had this idea. Here's something. Well, it's not actually about stablecoins, it's about market structure, but let's throw in a chapter on stablecoins, turned out to be 2 chapters, and we're good to go. That's how MiCA was born. So we launched it then, we negotiated it, and a few years later, we're now at the stage where MiCA has gone live. It's fully implemented, or fully applied, both the stablecoin part and the part on market structure on crypto asset service providers. That part has come into effect in the beginning of the year, but it's still very early days. Most member states are making benefit of a transition period because they need a long time to get their systems in order. But we see more and more crypto asset service providers, what we mean custodians, trading venues, brokers, what have you, advisors, getting licensed. And once they get licensed in a member state, they are free to do business throughout the European Union. That's sort of the carrot and stick, sort of that's the advantage. So as a licensed business, they can do business everywhere. What we also see is that MiCA has become a bit sort of the gold standard, silver standard, whatever standard, copper standard, lead standard of crypto regulation around the world. People start referencing it to say, well, that's if these Europeans, if it's good enough for the Europeans, it's good enough for everyone else. And this is called in political science the Brussels effect. It's not only in MiCA. We see this in many areas of policy and regulation where life actually can be quite simple. If you summarize life in one sentence, it's basically the US innovates, Asia copies and improves, and Europe regulates. That's basically how society is organized. So we're always first out of the box with regulation, because that's the way our system is set up, and we're a bit interventionist. So countries have a tendency, or countries around the world have a tendency to emulate European regulation. That's one country that's immune to the Brussels effect, and that's the United States. The United States does not emulate EU regulation. But there's something else, and that Churchill said, and it's very true, is that the Americans will always end up doing the right thing after having tried everything else. And they've tried lots of stuff, and so they're finally coming around, and it is my prediction, I have no certainty whatsoever, but it's my prediction that whatever they'll end up enacting, and I do think they will enact something on crypto regulation this year, will not look too different from what we have in MiCA. Of course, MiCA has some European specificities. Hopefully they don't copy that. MiCA has some weaving errors, and if any of you know about mistakes in MiCA, I know where they are. I probably know better where the mistakes are and all the problem areas in MiCA than any of you, because I know everything. Why it's written the way it's written, why that makes no sense, who needed to be pleased to get this agreed, and so on, and why this doesn't work. I know. But still, I always like people come and talk to me and say, well, that doesn't work, because then I get reinforced with, yes, it really doesn't work, or it really is a bad idea. But by and large, despite all of its imperfections, MiCA is a compromise between vastly different perspectives. People who are very favorable towards blockchain, and those were few and very far between, and people who were ignorant, which was the biggest majority, and then people who were very opposed, and usually also very ignorant. So I rarely come across people who are very knowledgeable about blockchain and who are very opposed. I come across people who are very opposed and very ignorant. And then you've got lots of people who sort of say, well, we don't really understand all of this. This looks like an accounting system, and we don't understand accounting. It was our worst subject in college, if ever they took it, like it was mine. I was awful at it. Anyway, so MiCA is there now. So people are saying, when is MiCA 2 coming? I've never, ever, ever said that we're going to do a MiCA 2, and I hope it's not going to come anytime soon, or that I will have nothing to do with it. The source of we need to have a MiCA 2 is actually, and I can say this now, in the privacy of everyone who's watching online, is I think it was the first who mentioned that we should have a MiCA 2 was the European Central Bank, who weren't a fan of MiCA 1 to begin with. So now they wanted the MiCA 2. They think it's actually a lot better than they feared it would be. But MiCA doesn't cover everything. There's a few points which were deliberately left out, or things which weren't mature enough to regulate, like non-fungible tokens are not really covered, although they are in a way. It's very complicated, so I can bore you to death as to how they are or aren't covered. Decentralized finance, and then crypto lending and borrowing. And the legislator, in its wisdom, said the European Commission will do a report on these three issues and will make appropriate proposals. So now everyone says, when is this report coming and what are you going to propose? I said, well, the report is still being worked on, and I can't work on it right now because I'm standing in front of you talking, so we can't write it right now. And tomorrow I'll be talking somewhere else, so I won't be writing it tomorrow. So it'll take a while, and that's a good thing. But eventually we'll get around to writing something. And then they think that it's not because we write something that we're going to propose something. Normally, I'm not saying that's how it always works, but normally in policymaking at the European Commission, we start with a problem. There has to be a problem, a market failure of some sort, an issue. And then we say, well, what is the problem? Is it the problem real? Is it the problem for Europe? Is it the problem for the single market? Assuming you have a problem and you can define the problem, is there something we at the European level can do about that problem? Many people believe that usually there is something. I doubt that. I don't think that many instances, even if I recognize there's a problem, that doesn't mean that we can do something about it. But even if we could do something about it, is regulation, MiCA 2, a solution to that problem? And is there a chance that the solution that you design gets adopted by the legislator? And if the chance is limited, then you're better off not proposing anything because they may make the problem worse. What often happens, unfortunately, is that we don't start with a problem, we start with a solution, and we end up with a problem. And I want to avoid that. So we are indeed looking at all of these developments, NFTs, decentralized finance, which I find very fascinating because I had an aha experience. In the beginning, when people start talking to me about decentralized finance, I said, that's nonsense. You can't borrow from a piece of code. You can borrow from someone, or someone can insure you, someone can take on the risk, but the protocol can't be a counterparty. And I've sort of come to accept that it is actually possible to do that. Now, most of what people present as being decentralized finance isn't decentralized at all. Yes, they may be using decentralizing technologies, they may be using some of this magic, blockchain magic, but there is actually a counterparty there. So this is not decentralized finance at all. But pure decentralized finance is possible. It's fairly niche, but it exists. But it's not because it exists and it's growing that it's a problem. And if it's not a problem, it doesn't require an answer. And if it were a problem, why would regulation be the answer to it? Because if you think about it, any regulation you may be familiar with is always addressed at, it always has what we call a personal scope. The people that have to comply with it. The entities or the persons to whom it is administered. Financial regulation, banking regulation, regulates banks. Securities regulation regulates securities and the issuers of securities and the trading venues and so on. It always regulates intermediaries. If there are no intermediaries, because it's decentralized, how are we going to apply this regulation that people want from us? I said, my head is not big enough. Well, my head is very big, but my mind is not big enough to imagine a regulatory doctrine that you can apply to non-persons, to non-entities. Unless it's a ban. You can say, no one is allowed to engage in any stuff like this. That you can do. Or no one is allowed to be involved in a DAO or in some grouping to develop codes that leads to this. If you live in a totalitarian regime, you can do this. But we like the rule of law, still. We think of ourselves as democracy, and we don't think it is useful to ban anything. Anyway, the more you ban things, the more you entice people to start doing it anyway, and they'll do it underground. So I don't believe in that. So what is therefore saying, well, if you're not going to do a MiCA 2, does that mean there is no future for MiCA? And that's not true. Paul put up a chart about how big Bitcoin is, and it's big, relatively speaking. But if you compare this to the market capitalization and the daily transaction volume in financial markets, it's negligible. It's completely negligible. At the height of the market, the total market cap of all crypto assets together was 3.8 trillion. That's a lot of money. But it's nothing compared to the total market capitalization in sovereign bonds, in corporate bonds, in funds, in equities, in all kinds of other, what the people call financial assets or real world assets. What's a real world word? I don't know. But anyway, these other assets, these are vastly, vastly, vastly bigger. And in a way, I do believe that MiCA is a bit of a sideshow because it only regulates the non-financial instruments digital assets, which, exciting as it may be, is a fairly small market. What I personally believe is going to be the big future of blockchain technology and is tokenization of financial assets. And that's where we are hopefully going, and I think we will be going. Now, when I started working on MiCA in 2018, no self-respecting finance person would want to be caught dead near anything to do with blockchain. Most financial institutions, and I know many of them, wanted to have absolutely nothing to do with it. Now, they're all engaged into one or the other form of tokenization of financial assets, and we want to do this and we want to do that. Now, for tokenization of financial assets and blockchain development in traditional financial markets to take off, we need a few things, and I'm about to close down. We need a few things to happen. First, the buy and the sell side need to be ready. The sell side needs to be ready to produce its stuff, its financial instruments, its securities in tokenized form, and the buy side needs to be interested in having tokenized versions of traditional financial instruments. And we're getting there. But this is really a market development. Secondly, you need to have acceptance of the infrastructures on which these things behave and evolve. And that brings us to permissionless chains. If you're going to have permissioned infrastructure, that really isn't any point in going for blockchain. You may as well keep the existing systems. But finance people were a bit apprehensive about all of this permissionless stuff. So it took them a while. Initially, they started developing their own permission systems. And now they're gradually coming around and sort of say, well, don't close off the permissionless route, but you need to allow us. And then comes in regulation. The financial sector is heavily, heavily regulated. And although we pride ourselves, although I don't, but many of my colleagues pride themselves on saying that the regulation is technology neutral, it is not. The regulation always is a reflection of the state of the art of the technology at the moment it is adopted. The regulation often requires the use of a particular technology, or it assumes it, and it is impossible to comply if you use a different technology stack. Even though the regulation doesn't prohibit that new technology stack, all of the concepts used make it impossible to comply it in this new environment. So we need to have some regulatory change, and we don't know yet what needs to be changed. Then we need to have proper capital charges. And there was a question about this, capital charges for crypto exposures. Now, the reason why they are so high in Basel is entirely due, and I take no reserve in saying this, we owe this entirely to the US banking regulators. They hiked them up so much because they did not want to get banks involved in crypto space. And so they put them up this high. Even though the US had never any intention of applying this, but that was to discourage the Europeans. Whether the US will now change it or whether they say, well, just keep these standards at a high level. These dumb Europeans will comply with them and we will just do something else. That may happen. And what also needs to happen, two more things, is central banks need to accept tokenized assets, tokenized financial instruments as collateral. If they don't, many finance people are not going to be interested in holding tokenized assets because when they have the tokenized assets for their yield, but also because they can use them as collateral for all kinds of other stuff. And that's some time to go. And then finally, and that's the most complicated part, is that private law questions, which are in Europe usually at member state level, need to be sorted out, need to evolve. And this is really a debate for lawyers. I'll give you an example. What does a transfer of ownership mean? Like this is defined, for example, in law, but what is transfer of ownership on a blockchain? I think the blockchain bros say, not your keys, not your coins. So you have to come to new conventions that are agreed as to what the legal transfer of ownership is, or is the possession of the keys, is that ownership? That is a very complicated legal debate, and I think the lawyers around the world are not yet ready to move. But I think they will, because the effects of this technology are so pervasive that it is unavoidable, and it will happen. But it's pervasive technology for back office stuff, which is extremely uninteresting. So Paul painted this picture of all the things they're doing with EY, and this is all back office stuff. Most people are not interested in that. They don't want to know how the accounting system operates. But I'm convinced that that's where it goes. I would like to conclude by saying that if we had no financial market infrastructure at all today, let's say nothing exists. There's no DTCC, there's no Euroclear, there are no banks, there's no nothing. And the people here in the room, although that's probably not a fair representation of society, but imagine you are a fair representation of society with all of your skills, you get told, build a financial market infrastructure. I am absolutely convinced that it will be built around blockchain and not around different systems of everyone having their own ledger and then reconcile everything. Because what is blockchain? It really is an accounting system on steroids that allows people and that allows things in society, economic processes, where there are many life cycle events and when there are many, many, many parties in the chain, when they need to work from a shared version of a common truth, if that's what's necessary to make the process efficient, that's where blockchain will really, really excel. And I do hope that that field is the broader economy and is not just going to be the mindlessly trading of tokens for speculative purposes. Thank you.